We're here in the Carmelite Abbey at Loughrea. This building was built around 1200 by the Anglo-Normans. But what we're looking at here today are actually the medieval windows associated with the Abbey. And I suppose one of the things that we notice that there are three distinctive styles of window here. There's a series of windows here that date back to the original foundation in 1200. Those are to my right here on the south wall, and also the outer frame of the east window, which would have been the principal window here within the choir. The lancet windows here to my right are very, very simple windows. But what we get here is we get windows with splays, this single lancet, but the one element that's missing from this is the actual glass, stained glass that was here. But we do know that there was stained glass here because if we examine the actual window itself, we see that there are holes for glazing bars here. And this clearly tells us that there was glass. It doesn't tell us that it was painted or stained glass, but we know from other buildings of that period that both coloured and stained glass was an important element of high status buildings like this. And of course, the most important window here in the Abbey would have been the east window, the window that illuminated the altar. And we'll take a closer look at that window. This is the east window. It's a multi-phase window. In the first phase, we actually see some of the early work here. We actually see the moulding up along the side here, the base, those little intersections along the shaft or the column itself, and then we have a capital on the top. This would have been a window made up probably of 5 openings, tall lancets, with the central one probably taller than the rest, or maybe even 3 of the central ones coming down in an order. As I said, this dates from the 13th century, from the original building of the Abbey itself. Then, for the second phase, in the 15th or maybe even early 16th century, we see this other window inserted. The older window has fallen out of use for some reason or other, and this switch-line tracery, this late medieval switch-line tracery window is installed. Much bigger, much bulkier, but one of the things we see here within the window itself and within the tracery is the use of a glazing groove to take the lead cames that hold the glass. And also we see the sockets here as well, as we did on the earlier 13th century one, where the iron bars would have been there to tie the windows in place. The most elaborate window here in St. Mary's is actually the window over the west doorway here. And it's an interesting 2-light window. This particular window has wonderful tracery, as we can see here. It also has this hood moulding that we get in the late medieval period. This dates to the 15th, 16th century. And on either side of it, we see a pair of mythical or medieval beasts. And this was quite common. You either get beasts like these to have symbolic meaning, or else you can actually get human heads. Sometimes those heads actually represent the donors, sometimes maybe the saint associated with the site. Of course, all we really got here is a feel for the medieval window. We couldn't discuss the glass because there's actually no glass surviving here. Any evidence we have of medieval glass here in Ireland comes from excavation or comes from documentary sources. If we want to understand stained glass and get an idea of how it might have looked in the past, we need to look at the modern stained glass of the 20th century.
So we've left the Carmelite Abbey and we've moved the short distance to St. Brendan's Cathedral. Neo-Gothic structure, so has connections with the Abbey. And in this instance, it's late 19th century. Perhaps not very remarkable from the outside, but once we come in, what we notice straight away is the stained glass. There's this fabulous collection of early 20th century Irish stained glass in the arts and crafts tradition. All of it is by the artists of An Túr Gloine, or the Tower of Glass, a studio that was founded in 1903 by the artist Sarah Purser and by Edward Martin, who has very strong local connections in Ardrahan. And we're going to look at some of the windows in the cathedral in detail. We can't look at them all because there's 25 of them, but we're going to look at a few. So in medieval times, stained glass was often regarded as the Bible of the poor. People often couldn't read, and so stained glass had a very strong kind of narrative or instructional quality to it, often using multi-panels in a window. So for instance, behind me we have 2 3-light windows, both of them with a strong narrative content. The Nativity on the left, the Passion on the right. But if we look at the Nativity in particular, we'll notice on the top left we've got the angel, Gabriel, appearing to the Blessed Virgin, but she's over on the top right. And then the next scene of interest chronologically is the Visitation, which is the bottom left, we've got Mary and her cousin Elizabeth embracing. She's pregnant with St. John the Baptist. And we have to move around a bit. Obviously, the center panel is the most important. It's the birth of Jesus, the standard nativity scene. But I think some of the more charming panels, which maybe have the most kind of medieval resonance, are the ones depicting the shepherds. So if we look at the very top, we see the angel appearing to two shepherds as a flock of sheep. What's intriguing about them is that they're sort of dressed in medieval garb. They're wearing a lot of clothes. The man on the left has kind of leather leggings, and he's got his pouch full of money. And it's not what we normally associate with scenes set in the Holy Land. And if we move to the middle on the left, here we have the shepherds again, and they're at the nativity scene, paying homage to the baby Jesus. And again, they're kind of straight out of medieval or Flemish painting, maybe. But what's interesting is that the figure who is in the foreground, he has kind of a Middle Eastern scarf about his neck. This black and white checkered scarf, but they do have a very strong kind of medieval quality to them that's a bit at variance with the other figures that are more kind of generically dressed as one might expect them to be in a nativity scene. So of all the artists from An Túr Gloine who have work in the cathedral, there's one who stands out. It's Michael Healy, because his very first solo window, St. Simeon, is here, but also one of his final windows, the Last Judgment. And that's the window behind me here. It actually took 4 years to do, completed in 1940. And what's interesting about it is, thematically, the Last Judgment is not something we see 20th century artists dealing with regularly, very much more of a medieval theme. What's unusual about it, I suppose, is that it's showing a very sort of judgmental, literally judgmental Christ. And it's very didactic, it's cautionary, it's telling us how to lead a good life and the consequences of not doing so. So we see God the Father in judgment up at the top in the center, and then on the extreme left at the bottom you see the saved, and there they are, hands clasped in prayer. They look very blissful, they're bobbing along in sort of a sea of tranquility. And once our eye moves towards the right, we begin to see what happens if you don't lead this prayerful religious existence. And we see the damned, and their faces are contorted, they're in turmoil, there's little sparks of red that suggests maybe flames and fire, damnation. Although it's not a medieval window in terms of style and treatment, in terms of subject matter and theme, it very much is. It's typical of what one would find in medieval churches and cathedrals. It's a warning to the faithful, how to behave, what kind of life to live, and the consequences of not doing so, which are pretty grim, as you can see. The final recruit to An Túr Gloine was Evie Hone, who's one of the big names in Irish stained glass. She worked alongside Michael Healy. She learned much of her craft from him, but her style couldn't be more different. She came from an entirely different tradition. She was a modernist, she was an abstract painter. So when we see her work, we're going to expect something very different. She has 2 windows in the cathedral, one of St. Bridget, done a year after Michael Healy died in 1942. And then she has the very last window that's in the main body of the cathedral, the rose window behind me. And the theme is the creation. And in many ways, of all the windows in the cathedral, this is the one that's probably most medievally inspired. Evie Hone, we know, had a particular interest in medieval sculpture. She has certainly seen all the windows on the continent. She was very well versed. And we see in the really strong use of colour, kind of the medieval context that she's drawing upon. So the strong blues, the reds, the green, the gold. And she uses a lot of symbols, and these would have been very commonplace in medieval stained glass as well. So in the center circle, we have God the Father, represented by the hand. We've got the dove, representing the Holy Spirit. And we've got the Pax Christi symbol, representing Christ. So in effect, we have the Trinity. But if you look closer, you're also going to see the sun and the moon, referencing creation. You're going to see the symbols Alpha and Omega, the first and last letters of the Greek alphabet, which are representative of Christ, the beginning and the end. And then in the peripheral stained glass, the 6 little smaller panels that are almost semicircular, we have different subject matters. And we have a lion representing the earth. We've got a pelican representing the sea. We've got a creature, sort of a fantastical creature representing fire. And then we've got an eagle representing air. And then the other two final ones are Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, and you've got the snake, again, very medieval in subject matter. And then at the bottom we have the Tree of Life, again, something that we find a lot in medieval stained glass. So it's a wonderful concluding window that finishes a series of stained glass windows in St. Brendan's Cathedral that started in 1903 and then concludes with Evie Hunt's Rose in 1950.